We'd like to welcome everybody back for the second half of Professor Fabio Rojas's lecture on sociology and the classical liberal tradition. This lecture titled Begin the Dialogue. Professor Rojas.
Thank you very much, Jason. Yeah, so this is called Sociology and the Classical Liberal Tradition, called Begin the Dialogue, because in the earlier lecture, I talked about how sociology is often seen as at odds with classical liberal thinking or social theory that sees value or normative value in markets. And we reviewed some of the major criticisms that come from classical sociology. And so I want to take this lecture to do something a little bit different, which is, first of all, to give an answer, at least a partial answer. These are big criticisms and they require a lot of thought, but at least to sketch out a basic answer to the three critics that we encountered in the first lecture. And then to be a little bit more constructive, to start a dialogue to say, you know, what is it about sociology that could be reconstructed or remobilized in order to address classical liberal concerns? So what is the criticism that people gave? And I'm going to review this in a little bit of detail. First, you know, Marx said that work is exploitation. And, you know, my response will be, it's not. There are other responses to Marx as well that I'll cover. Then remember, Durkheim said that capitalist institutions and markets really disrupt our moral fabric and make it hard to regulate ourselves. And I would say, you know, maybe that's not quite right. There may be a kernel of truth to that, but it's not like our community is destroyed. We're not isolated. And contra Simmel, I don't think modern culture is as bad as he makes it out to be. And then after I review those, I'm going to talk about bridges between classical liberalism and ways of thinking about the market. So, so Marx thought that capitalist labor is inherently exploitative and the entire system is unstable. Durkheim really thought it was about anomy, and Simmel thought that individualism created a mishmash modern culture. So that's kind of the one sentence summary of each. So let's start responding to those in a couple of ways. So just to reiterate, the Marxist critique of capitalism is that it relies on an oppressed underclass. So here's response number one that I think is pretty important, especially for graduate students to appreciate, which is that the Marxist criticism relies on the labor theory of value. You make something, you transfer the labor value to that to a commodity, which the capitalist takes. And that's the basis of exploitation theory. And often when people talk about Marxist theory of alienation, they may say, you know, it means that workers are pissed off or angry. That may be true, but that's not the meaning of alienation as Marx wrote it. What he means is that your labor is alienated. You're separated from the product of your labor. So Marx definitely had this theory that it's generally a good thing to consume what you make. It is a bad thing to create a commodity or something that can be traded. That's why he made a big deal about the difference between use value and labor value, right? Like there's the value that the object represents in terms of its labor, but there's also its exchange value, right? You like just what is how something is valued on the market, right? And I think one criticism of this, which I think is a very important one, is that this labor theory value is almost certainly wrong because value is subjective and not a reflection of an effort required to make a product. And this is not a sociological criticism. This actually comes from economics. And the issue is that most economists, or at least most of the classical economists, and you might even include Marx in this umbrella, bought into the labor theory value. Bastiat did, Adam Smith did, Say did, all these early economists believe that you know, the more you work on something, the more it represents your value, your labor value. And Marx is probably the last super famous economic thinker or writer who believed this. And then in the 1870s and 80s, we had something called the subjectivist revolution in economics, which is this really deep rethinking of value. And value is no longer all about, you know, making a product and then this thing that you give to somebody else. Instead, objects are just out there, services are just out there, and value is subjective. The value that people place on a product does not reflect the amount of labor that went into it. Instead, it reflects, you know, relative supply and demand and what that person values, right? And this helps resolve some issues in the labor theory of value. For example, water seems to be extremely valuable, but its price can be very low. In some cases, you'd have to put in a lot of effort to get the water if you're in a desert, in other cases not. And then you realize, you know, all this confusion about value, about why the same product or the same thing can vary in its price so much. is that, it's reflection of subjective wants and needs and relative supply and demand. So once you understand that, then this whole theory of exploitation actually doesn't have a lot of credence. It doesn't hold a lot of water. And even some modern Marxists will even concede this point. So for example, there was a movement amongst Marxists called the micro foundations or analytical Marxism. That was kind of a big thing in the 70s and 80s and even early 90s. And one of the arguments of analytical Marxists was that, yeah, if you look at Marx from a modern economic perspective, you see that some of the claims don't make any sense. So you have to come up with a new, modern, updated, analytical version of Marxism, which we could talk about later about how that works. But in general, even a lot of modern Marxists will recognize this labor theory of value is problematic. And for that reason, that's a big issue. And once you buy into that criticism that, value is truly subjective, then where is the exploitation, right? There's some amount of labor that you're able to perform. Some people value it, some people don't. You compete with people, and then you get income based on that. And commodification and fetishization of commodities is much less of an issue once you drop the labor theory of value. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about Marx more than the other social theorists, because I think that Marx is probably the most popular person to talk about. So I want to give two more additional responses. So another issue with the Marxian critique of the world or depiction of the world of the capitalist economy is that there are numerous empirical phenomena that seem to counteract the basic Marxist analysis. So remember, one of the most introductory basic points of Marxist theory is that there's class struggle, right? There's people on top and they're oppressing people on the bottom. It's even literally the first sentence of the Communist Manifesto. But if you look at the economy in the 20th century, you see a lot of things that were unseen in orthodox Marxist theory. For example, there was this rise of a managerial class. There's a rise of a group of people who are materially well off. They work in managerial or what you might call white collar roles. They don't own industry in the traditional sense, but they are clearly not workers either, not manual laborers. So this would be like accountants, managers, consultants, analysts, all these people. And they're big. A lot of people have improved their lot in life by becoming a middle class manager in some sort of corporation or administrative setting. And this is simply not foreseen by Marx, this idea that there's an oppressor and oppressed. There's like more to it than that. And even some well-known Marxists in sociology, such as Eric Olin Wright, who sadly passed away recently, he came up with an alternative theory of class structure to account for these changes. Another thing that Marx did not foresee was the decline in poverty rates. So we know that poverty in the US has decreased since at least the mid-1900s because of census data. And what the census will do is that every time they do the census, they collect information on income and well-being. They ask, how much money does a person need in the United States on the average to afford food, clothing, and some basic shelter? And it varies from year to year, but roughly for one person, it's between $15,000 and $20,000 in the US. That's like the average amount needed for some shelter, food, and basic medical care. And about 30% of people did not make that level of income. They made below it. So that's one out of three people in 1950 could not afford food and shelter by themselves in the United States. However, that dropped down to between 15 and 20%. So that goes up during a recession, then goes down during a boom. But that corresponds to tens of millions of people getting out of poverty. So that kind of undermines the point that the Marxists often have, which is that capitalist economies are just driving people to rampant poverty. It also is true in a global sense that one thing we saw after the liberalization of the Chinese and Indian economies is that a lot of those people in those countries, they got out of poverty. And we know that because of various global organizations like the World Bank and other organizations that collect data on like how many people don't have enough money to buy food. Like that's the poverty level or the level of starvation. And as countries liberalize, they actually decrease the number of people who are in abject poverty. And actually so big that this actually changed the global Gini index, right? Like liberalizing China and India have actually, made things a little bit more equal in terms of income because you don't have so many people who are so poor. So secondly, this whole analysis of two classes always fighting and one class always getting the short end of the stick doesn't really seem to conform terribly well to what we saw in the 20th century. And then there's a final point, which I think is a very cute point, but I think a very profound point, which is that, capitalism is seen as something that drives massive inequality. And the standard way we measure inequality is through the Gini index. And one thing that you find is that wealthier, more capitalist societies actually have a lower Gini index, right? So, so basically the left-right axis on this graph is the Gini index. The up-down axis is at GDP, or basically how much money people make per year. We can have arguments about wealth and what the Gini index means, but roughly speaking, if you thought the wealthier, the more capitalist societies are more unequal, you'd see the dots going up as you go from left to right rather than going down. And this is like a basic fact of comparative politics that everybody knows about, but people just don't like talking about, because it undermines the basic issue that, if you look globally, capitalist economies are actually a little bit more equal. They're actually able to address things better than other societies. Now let me talk a little bit about Emil Durkheim and his approach to markets. So in one way, I'm going to give him credit. Durkheim was clearly correct. The decline of agriculturalism and industrialism and the rise of industrialism meant the decline of a certain type of tight-knit community. I think that's absolutely true. It's going to be very difficult in modern society to recreate like the small town feeling or, the rhythm of the agricultural life where everybody's like, tightly knit through this, pre-industrial economy. I think that's clearly true. However, Durkheim seems to overlook a couple of things I think are really worth mentioning. First of all, even though that earlier type of society was valuable, it doesn't mean it was perfect, right? So it had advantages, but certainly suppressed certain types of people, right? So one thing that we appreciate now is that, it's okay to have ethnic diversity. It's okay to have cultural diversity. It's okay for men and women to be equal. There's also diversity in terms of sexual orientations. And to be honest, like there are exceptions. If you talk to anthropologists, there are exceptions. But in general, a lot of these agricultural societies were very hierarchical, right? And often the people at the bottom of the hierarchy did not have very good lives, or they had to suppress some aspect of themselves in order to survive. So I think that's one thing that Durkheim really can be critiqued on, which is he buys into a very romantic version of agricultural life, of this kind of pre-industrial solidarity, right? And then even on a deeper level, it's a mistake to believe that no other forms of association and community have arisen in modern times. And here, I'm not going to say that qualitatively you're going to get the same thing that we had in small town life or agricultural life, but still we have an amazing range of forms of solidarity and community that Durkheim did not foresee, like social media. We saw with the waves of protests recently that people use social media to organize themselves to come out. Professional life, Durkheim and Simmel both make fun about professional associations, but they're actually very important. I hope that you're enjoying graduate school and enjoying meeting other graduate students and being socialized into your academic discipline. That's a really great thing. Modern extended families. So we don't have the extended family that we used to, but still, we do have very interesting new forms of family that I think people did not appreciate. And there are more forms of association that we could talk about. And people like Durkheim and maybe modern people like Robert Putnam, who are worried that the modern capitalist society is eroding our social bonds, I think they often overlook these different kinds of association that are very meaningful. Like I said, it's not a perfect replacement. I'm not going to say you get exactly the same bundle of goods from modern social life that we had in agricultural life. But I would say don't underestimate that. There's still a lot of value there, and people still have very meaningful lives. They even might regulate their emotions. And maybe social media is where I might say Durkheim is correct, where social media seems to release people's bad emotions sometimes. But there's still other things in society that seem to really encourage good things. Let me talk about Simmel a little bit and respond to Georg Simmel. I think he was correct on a very important point, which we do live in a relatively individualistic society. The level of individualism, especially in Western countries, is so remarkable. When people visit from India or China, they always say, my God, your society is so me oriented, right? And social media is exactly what Simmel would point to and say, look, that's exactly the problem that I'm talking about. Just look at that, look at all these people, this attention grabbing, and that can be very dysfunctional, right? And I think, Simmel has a fair point there. But still, even though there are some issues, it doesn't seem to be that bad. Kind of using modern jargon, we might say that's a first world problem. Like, we live in this individual society. maybe social media is not good in some ways, but it's not that bad of a problem compared to the alternatives of saying living in a medieval society with an aristocracy and serfdom. It's not as bad as, like, let's say living in Greek society where they had slavery. And it's even better than earlier forms of Western democratic capitalist societies, which allowed all kinds of repression. So I would say, yeah, maybe that's true. Individualism is true, but once you recognize people are individuals, they assert their rights, they get rid of other stuff. Our society is a little bit more fractured than before, but it's not that bad, right? And furthermore, in a modern capitalist society, you can enjoy any type of culture that you want. So if you really believe, and this is an argument I make to conservatives, they'll often say things like, aren't we missing the family? Are we missing the older style of life? I would say, well, you can do it if you want. There are religious groups and religious organizations which have a very tight community. The example I always use is the Church of Latter-day Saints, also known as the Mormon Church. And if you want to pay their tithe, their fee for being part of the religion and contributing, they will provide you a very in-depth social life, very structured with lots of moral teachings. And it's up to you. You can decide whether you want to do that or not. So if you want a more devout or better culture, one that expresses some value or goal, there's nothing preventing you from doing that. In fact, I would say modern societies are to be lauded and that they actually do provide alternatives. And, in older societies, the alternative was very hard to pursue, but now you can do it. If you really want to be Amish, you could join a farm, or you really want to be the LDS, you could join that. But if you don't, that's okay too. So I think my response to Simmel kind of goes along those lines, which is, like maybe you do have a point, but it's not as bad as you make it out to be. It's more of a first world problem. And if you're searching for community, it's there. And they'll gladly take your money, and they can be very loving and supportive communities if you want to do it. So what I want to do now to spend the next maybe 10 or 15 minutes is talking about bridges between sociology and classical liberalism. And I think this is important to think about because it's not enough just to say, I think some of these sociological critics of the market may have exaggerated their claims, or maybe they've been wrong, or they have a kernel of truth to them, or some element of truth to them. But instead to be more proactive and say, what's the alternative? What is a classical liberalism informed by sociology look like? Or what does sociology informed by classical liberalism look like? What would that actually look like? Well, I would suggest 3 avenues for dialogue and building bridges that are definitely worth considering. One is revising the history of sociology. Right now, sociology definitely presents a canon or historical development which focuses on people who did not really buy into markets or voluntary action as a terribly good thing. Number 2, there are concrete aspects or branches of sociology like social network analysis and economic sociology that directly speak to theories of spontaneous order and other traditions like Austrian economics. And then third is, sociology can give you tools for thinking about the culture of freedom. So in other words, kind of what cultural preconditions are required in order for society to be very tolerant and to rely on voluntary institutions rather than coercive institutions. So bridge number 1, let's talk a few minutes about that. It's absolutely true that the most influential sociology has been critical of the market-based society or the voluntary society. That's absolutely true, but that doesn't mean there weren't important sociologists who contributed to classical liberal ideas that are worth thinking about. Probably the 2 that come to mind are Herbert Spencer. He often gets trashed as a social Darwinist. If you define a social Darwinist as somebody who thinks that people should suffer and their suffering is a sign that they're not fit, then Spencer definitely was not a Darwinist in that sense. It's pretty clear that he was not. Rather, he was an evolutionist. He did believe that societies evolve, so he was a Darwinist in that sense. Like many classical liberals, he definitely thought that rules that regulate the lives of the poor people were bad rules. Similarly, he didn't believe in subsidies. He didn't believe in subsidizing or providing, government aid to poor people. But that's different than saying that poor people should suffer. In fact, he thought that the liberal social order would provide lots of ways for the poor to improve their lives. That's very clear if you actually read him, not just selectively take out a sentence or 2, but actually read the entire text. He was also a free trader and an anti-imperialist. So that's a good, bridge to think about, which is, what ideas from Herbert Spencer or some of these classical figures are worth reviving or thinking about. There are already people who think about Spencer in sociology. They tend to be Durkheimians who are interested in ritual because he often talked about ritual and group life. But also, you can just think about his political economy as well. Another figure that I think is an interesting figure is William Graham Sumner. He's interesting because he was one of the first professors of sociology at Yale University, and he was a free trader. And if you read his biography at the American Sociological Association website, they have his biography because he was actually the president of the American Sociological Association, like the third or fourth president back in like 1898. And in his biography, they say that he got in trouble with the Yale administration for teaching laissez-faire economics. Like people really didn't want him to teach that. They kind of got on his case for it, but he insisted on doing it. So Sumner is an interesting figure to think about. His book Folkways is actually a very interesting book that still resonates amongst institutional theorists. And in Folkways, one of his big arguments is that top-down solutions to social problems often run into issues because they don't take into consideration the folkways, the local mores or local customs of a community. And that's why a lot of top-down social reform doesn't always work. And so the book is theoretical and in the sense of telling you what a social custom is, what are mores, what are institutions, but that is also normative, and he offers his opinion about why some customs, reforms don't work because they run up into a wall of custom. And so it has to be kind of a more bottom-up thing. Also, there's an essay that I think should be widely popular amongst academics called Conquest of the US by Spain, which is a brilliant essay, where essentially he says, look, by engaging in imperialism and engaging in this war, this is the War of 1898 against Spain, basically you've become the imperialist. And in that sense, the Spanish have conquered the US. We become just like them. So I think that kind of anti-imperialist strain would be very friendly to a lot of modern sociologists. And so this raises a great question, which is what traditions have been lost in sociology by an emphasis on, or an exclusive emphasis on people who don't buy into markets or think that markets are very problematic. We're missing a lot of anti-imperialists. We're missing people who have interesting things to say about institutionalism. But think about what other ideas were lost and need to be recovered by closely reading these older texts. So I'm not the kind of sociologist who thinks that the only thing in life is reading classical sociology. Far from it. Actually, I'm a modernist. I really do believe in updating the classics and inventing new theory and testing new theory. But still, there are some golden oldies that can be revisited in order to appreciate what we don't have today. Bridge number 2, let me talk about this. I think this is a very obvious and clear bridge between classical liberal or libertarian social theory and modern sociology, and that's spontaneous order theory. And if you've never read any Hayek or never read any of his followers, the idea is that, societies are not top-down constructions. They're more like bottom-up constructions. Trade is a process of discovery. So this is kind of came up in Adam Smith, but Mises and Hayek and these other classical liberal writers kind of revived this insight and kind of expanded the theory of spontaneous order. And as people trade, as they write contracts, as they litigate cases in court, they go through a discovery process. They go through a process of discovering what works, what doesn't work, what's the lesson learned from doing this kind of transaction versus that kind of transaction? What is learned if we develop a rule that says you can do this versus a rule saying that you can't do that? And society is rather an accumulated, decentralized storehouse of knowledge that helps organize not just trade, but the law, language, and other kinds of social behavior. And this is a very powerful idea, and it really counteracts the idea that, like some wise council of technocrats could order society. Maybe there's something to be said for having this point of view. I'll also note the American Political Science Review recently ran an article that was highly critical of spontaneous order theory and the way that I'm presenting it, so you should check that out too. But still, on an empirical point, setting aside normative considerations of spontaneous order, it's really remarkable that sociologists already think of society in these terms. So if you really say empirically, what is society? What is it? Is it like a Hobbesian thing where you have a sovereign who sits down the rules and structures everything from the top down? Is it like the Politburo, like in a socialist state where a political organization decides what is produced? Actually, most sociologists would openly say it's this kind of decentralized thing. A lot of progressive sociologists might say, well, it's wrapped up in politics, like politicians have to come in and set the rules, and there are regulations that markets have to obey. But when you really get down to it, like social relations are decentralized, culture is decentralized, markets are decentralized, human relationships in general are very decentralized. And that is just the way things are. And then, maybe the difference is that a lot of progressive sociologists will critique that, while a lot of classical liberals would praise that, right? But still, it provides an important overlap of visions where you realize you're talking about the same thing, really talking about the same thing. So once you realize that Austrianism has this big tradition of spontaneous orders and discovery, and then there are ideas like, cultural theory and theories of social networks that describe the world in decentralized fashion, there could be a better discussion. There could be a better link. So that could be a project that maybe somebody attending the seminar could think more deeply about. Then number 3 is a project I've been thinking about for a while, and I've already got some papers in progress, which is one thing that sociologists are very good about talking about how a lack of freedom destroys communities. So they're very good at documenting how repression is a bad thing. It creates all these dysfunctions. Probably an author that a lot of you might enjoy is Orlando Patterson, who wrote about slavery. He talks about slavery as a form of social death. But also conversely, he's very interested in what people think freedom is, right? But what I learned from reading Orlando Patterson's work is that, there's a very rich sociology of how a lack of freedom is a bad thing, like putting people in prison, mass incarceration, slavery, segregation, or even harassing people in private settings, like, gender relationships. We have a lot of evidence about how this lack of tolerance or lack of freedom is really damaging to people in many different ways. And I love that phrase, social death, because it really encapsulates how incredibly harmful slavery and these other institutions are. They really atrophy, and they're a cancer in the larger community, right? But now you can ask the other side. Instead of saying, how do people justify repression, or what are the effects of repression on communities? You could ask, okay, what are the cultural conditions that enable freedom and liberal social orders? So you can think of somebody like Deidre McCloskey in her book on bourgeois virtue. That's kind of part of the story. But you can dig deeper and say, where does bourgeois virtue come from? What social practices and social processes are out there that would encourage tolerance, right? So for example, when people socially construct the world, they sit together, they talk about what the world is like, what kinds of attitudes or beliefs lead to tolerance, right? So for example, one thing I've argued in other talks is that external threats are a great way to reduce freedom in a society. If you say there's an external threat, that's usually something that can justify by restriction of your behavior. So then the converse question is, what kinds of situations or processes make us feel more comfortable or more tolerant? You discover like wealthy societies tend to be more tolerant, so maybe wealth is part of it. And so we can ask more questions like that, like how do we think about the world in ways that encourage tolerance and liberalism rather than a jump to asking people to repress and control each other, right? And it's a very underdeveloped theory, very underdeveloped set of questions. So I think this is definitely something that's definitely worth working.
So first question, the focus that you've discussed here has been on the sociology of Western societies. What about other non-Western cultures, especially Islamic and Japanese Eastern cultures?
Right, so that's a really great question. And this is always a big issue in sociology, which is that sociology is essentially a Western discipline, So it's not like literature, where literature exists in all parts of the world. But, academic sociology, where we do surveys and ethnographies and that sort of thing, is the Western intellectual tradition. It has some dodgy history. So people have pointed out that often anthropology and sociology have been complicit in, colonial enterprises and that sort of thing. But still, that doesn't mean we can't pull back and learn lessons from other parts of the world and think about what they have to say. I would not go to the classical texts. For example, like Karl Marx and Durkheim and Simmel had very distorted views of what other countries and societies and cultures were like. And this is a big issue. Like if you really read what Weber or some of these classical sociologists have to say about other countries, they really get it spectacularly wrong. And frankly, some of them were kind of racist, and they had extremely negative points of view about people from other cultures. We can talk about that later. But in general, we can look at the world and we can realize that by looking at other cultures and other historical trajectories, we can learn something pretty important, pretty important. So for example, like I'll just use a simple example from classical liberalism, an insight that can be enriched by looking at other societies. So for example, Ludwig von Mises had this argument. He said, look, socialist economies are bound to collapse, right? Because they have problems calculating prices and efficiently allocating resources. You're just going to get constant shortages or surpluses that don't make a lot of sense. And I think on a certain point that was correct. Like, we know from empirical practice that as soon as people start nationalizing the oil industry and nationalize the auto industry, you're going to see toilet paper shortages. We're seeing it in Venezuela today as we speak. But that doesn't mean that socialism will immediately collapse. And we know that from looking at many societies. So for example, Chinese society really did go the full run. They collectivized agriculture. The disaster you expected happened. There was starvation. There was political repression. We saw the Cultural Revolution. Literally millions of people died in the Great Leap Forward and then the Cultural Revolution in the 1960s. Like, it was bad. But socialism did not collapse the way Mises thought, or some of his followers, or some of the Rothbard era libertarians thought. That what happened at the Berlin Wall was very idiosyncratic. Instead, socialist societies like the Chinese state seems to have some element of reform in it, where they can reform, and it doesn't, and they're still way less wealthy, but they can somehow liberalize part way. They can build institutions that allow the Chinese Communist Party to retain power, and so forth. And so that's an example where looking at different societies, we can actually say, okay, well, socialism, looking at many societies, it just doesn't work. Having the government run all markets just doesn't seem to work. But the Berlin Wall style collapse is only one outcome. You can get kind of a rise of an authoritarian like Putin, or you get like something like what's happening in China, where the Communist Party mutates and kind of integrates itself and hybridizes with the market in this weird semi-state, semi-market situation. And that's just one example. There's lots of ways you can enrich classical liberal thought by looking at the trajectory of markets and social relationships in all parts of the world.
This is a pretty broad question about exploitation from the breakout group, so I'm going to try to synthesize it a little bit. So set aside the labor theory of value. Are there still some relationships in the market that we might want to classify as exploitative? So take a rich business owner who is making a lot of money from his workers, and yet they are working in poor working conditions. Their jobs are stressful. They don't have sufficient bathroom breaks and things like that. They have all of the work being placed on them. Meanwhile, the owners and investors are just making billions and billions of dollars. Is this a relationship that we should classify as exploitative?
Right, and so exploitative is kind of a very loaded term. Instead, what I would focus on is something that modern sociologists do, which is to classify good jobs versus bad jobs. Like jobs that are clearly miserable versus jobs which are better in some very concrete way. So let me give you a simple example. Like in this literature in sociology, they'll say that something like a good job is one where you have more self-control. So for example, being a professor is considered a good job because there's no boss, or there's a boss but in a very removed way. I get to choose what to teach. It's pretty hands-off. Like a doctor, similarly, they get to run their own thing. Let's say a garment worker, like working in a garment shop, working like 10 or 15 hours a day for low pay. The pay is low. That's not good in that sense. It's a bad job, and they have a boss that pushes you around, and so forth. So the question for me isn't, can I imagine a world with no bad jobs? Like every world I've ever seen has lots of bad jobs. The question is, what percentage of the population has to do bad jobs? Is that decreasing over time? And the answer is clearly yes. I mean, we're going from a 90% plus agricultural economy like 1820 to one where most people are industrial workers or white collar workers in the year 2020. We could also ask whether the badness of certain types of jobs actually is decreasing over time, right? And I think the answer is yes. So there are definitely cases of abusive employers who put people in bad conditions. But on the average, if you compare the working conditions of, say, a garment worker today with a garment worker from 1920, definitely has changed. Some of it has to do with regulations where people say you don't have to do it this way, but also we're just a wealthier society. It's just easier. Like we invented air conditioning, right? So maybe not all workers have air conditioning, but more of them had it before, right? And so I think that is, the way I would approach the issue, because once you say exploitation, you automatically say there's a good guy and a bad guy. And I think that's what Marx was doing rhetorically, to say that inherently there's no way of getting around good guys and bad guys. And so what I would say is like, okay, what is horrible about labor? And yeah, like agricultural labor was dangerous. Industrial labor is better, it's still dangerous, right? And you could say, okay, what aspects of labor markets have improved over time? And I would say, just look at the countries that have fairly liberal economies. That could be the US, that could be Sweden, that could be France. The average worker there is better than it was 100 years ago. It's also better cross-nationally, like it's better than places that don't have liberal economies. So if you want to say that the fact there is some badness as exploitative, you're allowed to use that label. I'm not going to argue with you, but rather I think it's a little bit easier, you get more clarity when you say jobs can be good or bad. Do we have less bad jobs, or the jobs that we have, are they becoming less bad over time? And I think you get a little bit more clarity when you ask the question that way.
What makes something a quote unquote fair price? By what standard do we judge the fairness of a transaction?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And that's really not even a social, well, there's a sociological version of it, which is you can ask, when do people think a price is fair, right? So when do people think that you're doing something fairly? And that's different than, is it fair really, right? That's a normative question, that's a philosophical question. The first question is about sociology and social relationships, right? So if you're asking the question, when do people think a transaction is fair? You get a lot of really interesting answers. Like, for example, socially, there are certain things that we're afraid to trade, right? So for example, like, we would say, owning other people is just bad in all situations, right? That's just like, socially, we've gotten to that point where just like ownership over others is seen with disgust. There's a literature on disgusting markets, right? That's kind of an interesting thing where you say, just intrinsically, for example, some things are seen as disgusting. For example, like, we know that if you donate a pint of blood every other month or something, it's not going to harm your health, you're going to be fine. But trading in blood and trading in organs is considered very disgusting, right? So we know that there are these social or cultural frameworks around certain kinds of markets. Also, for example, people will say things like profit just seems inherently dodgy. Like if I'm profiting off of something, it seems that like I'm getting more out of the deal than somebody else, right? So sociologically, we can ask what cultural frameworks do we have, what kinds of markets elicit disgust, what kinds of transactions are thought to be fair or unfair, right? And then we can take the normative question and say, if a transaction is voluntary, is it ever unfair, right? So like the hardcore libertarian position is that, the answer is no, right? To say if it's voluntarily transacted, it's probably okay. If people have real alternatives, I don't think I would jump and say that like every single transaction ever happening under the sun may fit that, but maybe more than you might think. So for example, during COVID, some people would say if a certain medical supply went up in price, that's price gouging, and they would say that's unfair. And I would say, from a normative perspective, that's actually, fine. It creates an incentive for people to provide extra medical equipment, to say that that person cannot do that music. You're going to have to use the police to stop them from selling it. You're going to have to fine them. And you can talk about whether that's normatively permissible or not. So in general, like I could imagine, you know, situations where I would say, well, that was really an unfair price or something was really wrong with that transaction. But in most everyday fluctuations of prices, you know, I would say, prices reflect supply and demand. They convey valuable information. If it's an adult who's of competent mind, who has alternatives, you know, they can judge for themselves and they'll make mistakes. That's part of being human, right? So somebody could say, I paid too much. It's like, well, that's life. You know, you make mistakes and you can vote the wrong way, right? But we don't say there's unfair voting, right? We just say sometimes you just make a bad choice. Same thing with markets.
Is it fair to say that capitalism can bolster pluralism?
Yeah, so this is actually a very profound question about the relationship between a political order and economic order. And, say, take somebody like Marx who thought like, nope, it's not pluralistic at all. No way. What's happening, according to Marx, what's happening in a capitalist society is that you get a bunch of rich people who really just tell other people what to do, and it's their way or the highway, right? That's it. So it's not very pluralistic at all. And any kind of ideological or social diversity is just window dressing on that, right? That's the Marxist point of view. Then at the very other end of the extreme, you get people like Milton Friedman, who famously says something like, capitalism and diversity go together, like good politics and good markets go together, right? And so then you have to ask what is the mechanism that makes you believe one version versus the other? And I'll tell you what my current thinking on this question is, which is that when societies have excess wealth, they chill out a little bit. And this is a finding from multiple fields. So for example, when people, in anthropology, when people go to agriculture and they're able to have a little bit of extra wealth, they tend to, to not raid other local groups as much. In modern times, when people industrialize and they get a little bit more wealth, you see less conflict. So for example, there's a political science literature that argues about why is it that wealthier capitalist and democratic societies no longer go to war against each other. And people will argue about exactly what the causation is, whether it's a spurious correlation or whether there's another factor, whether it really is causal or which direction it goes. But the point is the link is there. Another finding from political science is that civil wars almost disappear once you hit about $10,000 per person in a country or $15,000 per person. So once you hit a certain level of economic development, civil wars, like actual armed conflict between militias, tends to be very rare. So I would say empirically that suggests to us that there is some link between wealth and diversity and pluralism and tolerance. It may not be as clean as maybe the greatest cheerleaders might say. Maybe Milton Friedman didn't get it right or wrong, but there seems to be something there that you should definitely pay attention to.
What are the sociological factors that conduce to individuals in liberal societies espousing illiberalism?
Oh yeah, so that's a really great question. So if you're in a relatively free state, why is it that you start wanting to repress other people? So I think there's a couple of answers that are easy answers that have been backed up by literature, like external threat. Every time there's an external threat, then people feel it's okay to be illiberal, right? And even though they may even know it, just like, I know there's an external threat, but what are you going to do? Like, you have to do this in order to fight the bad guys. One very sad, horrible, tragic example is the incarceration of Japanese during World War II. Basically, Japanese were pretty well accepted in the West Coast society, like in West Coast America, before World War II. There's definitely anti-Asian sentiment. But the point is, they were building communities, they had families, they had businesses, there were even entire towns and neighborhoods of Japanese Americans. And FDR wanted to put them in the camps. And even some of his, historians have documented this. Even some of his staff said, what's the point? They're clearly Americans, they're not a threat. But FDR was like, nope. And then people went along with it. They're like, yeah, we know we're supposed to be tolerant and free, but we're in the middle of a war, so we got to lock them up, right? And relocate them. And relocation is a very kind word for simply putting people in jail, right? It may, thankfully the US is not like some other countries, but still, that's putting people in jail for just being Japanese. So that's a clear case of an external threat. Often people will become a liberal when they think their own personal economic fortunes are about to go down. So a lot of surveys, things like anti-foreigner bias, xenophobia, racist beliefs about other people tend to increase when people think they're about to lose a job. Those are probably not the only things, but those are two easy ones to think about: external threats and personal economic instability.
Back to exploitation. What about the case where, well, let me back up. The person who wrote the question notes that if there is a consensual relationship that occurs and people have other viable options, that's sort of one set of cases. But there might be a concern that in many cases in capitalist economies, people don't have good options to choose other better jobs. So for whatever reason, they're forced into low-paying jobs with bad working conditions, that sort of thing.
Right. And so, this is a long-standing argument about what freedom means to the capitalist economy. And the first thing I always say is that, I don't preach utopias. I'm not going to tell you that in American history, every single employer has been good. Lots of them have been bad. We could go through, I could even speak about people who've employed me, who've engaged in less than honorable behavior, but that's not what I'm saying. However, the question is, not really whether bad employers exist or bad situations exist. It's on the average, as a whole, are things getting better? So for example, people say, what about company towns? There was a phenomena of company towns where you go there and it'd be kind of almost like a very strong relationship where you would have to spend all your money in the company store and thus you're kind of tied to it. I'm not a historian of that, so I don't know whether those claims are true, like whether that's an accurate representation of that. I would have to judge the evidence for myself, but it's not hard to believe that maybe you would have set up a factory and try to recover all the income you paid out in wages like that. That's not unreasonable to believe that would ever happen. However, as time goes on, people develop more tools and more mechanisms for not being in that situation in the first place. So for example, mobility, right? So all those stories of company towns are from like the 1880s, 1920s. As soon as you invent the highway system and cars and buses, for the price of a few hours of labor, you could be in another town in an hour, right? Or think about the modern world where people will say, what's my employer like? We'll go to Yelp or go to these private websites which complain about various employers. Am I preaching utopia or perfection? No. What I'm saying is that overall, there's gradual improvement, where if there are bad situations, you have more and more opportunities to get out of them today than you did 100 years ago or hundreds of years ago. Then, of course, there's always the comparative point, which is, if you think your boss is bad now, imagine what your boss in a Soviet state would be like.
What is the role of the state in creating protections for workers for some of those worst case employer practices?
Yeah, so we can start with like very easy cases that I think are where I think like 99.9% of people would agree. Like everybody from like a Marxist to a libertarian would all agree. So there are cases where people have really been held against their will, right? You'll read news articles saying, African Americans were de facto enslaved. It was not legal, but it was in reality enslaved up until like the 1960s or 70s. And this has to do with the fact that in some parts of the country, there were still not roads, they're very remote places. So people were still held subject by force, right? There are also other places where, it was very easy for employers to rip people off in terms of wages, right? So there, I think, we would start with a point of agreement and say, look, if it's servitude, just call slavery for what it is, and that's illegal. And, you'll see that in some cases, and I think that's where everybody would agree, like, that's not a problem if the state goes in to, clean that up, put those people in jail and liberate people. That's like probably the easiest case. And, then there's a spectrum, right? Where then people would say, okay, well, I'm not talking about cases where you're held against your will, literally, right? And then you can say, well, what are the mechanisms for allowing people to to escape those. And I think that's where libertarians and some others would agree and say that some of the solutions offered may be counterproductive, right? So for example, if you require so many regulations in hiring and protecting people, then fewer people will be employed, right? Or it's hard to move between jobs because they know if you move from one job to another, there are all these protections built in place, and so you have to say there's a trade-off, right? And that's where the classical liberals and progressives might depart, right? And say, okay, we recognize that maybe there's values and protections, but they could be so expensive and so provide so much friction in labor markets that kind of defeats the purpose. So that gets to cases of genuine disagreement. So in that comment, there were multiple things that range from the situation where we'd all agree, right, that that's bad and there should be some intervention, the places where classical liberals and others might disagree.
If many progressive sociologists are skeptical of decentralization, as you've mentioned, how is that consistent with their criticisms of hierarchy?
Yeah, it's it's actually a really good question, and I think the issue here is that there is not a tradition in sociology of really thinking carefully about normative commitments and then merging that with empirical findings. Right, I think that's maybe the issue. And that's different than, say, in poli-sci and economics, where they do it in different ways. So in poli-sci, what they do is they have a branch called political theory. And then they have a discussion of like, okay, well, there are these classical political theorists, and they offer these descriptions of how government should work. Is that a just government? Is that good government? And then you can say, okay, empirical political scientists, tell me how the government actually works in this case. And you can have a really good dialogue that way. Or in economics, what they do for your econ grad students, in first year micro, they have something called welfare economics. And that term does not denote, programs that are about transferring resources to people, but rather just counting people's well-being or welfare and doing a cost-benefit analysis of that. And that's called welfare economics. So what you say is, okay, there are these deontological values that are out there, or virtue ethics or whatever. That's not what econ is about. What we can do is measure costs and benefits. So as a utilitarian argument, they say, we're translating our values into a utilitarian calculus, and then you can model that. So either the political theory approach to ethics and normative issues and the welfare economics approach to normative issues, neither of those exist in sociology. So there's a bit of disconnection here and there where you'll find people say, yeah, we're all progressive here. And it's like, okay, I actually sympathize with a lot of progressives, but maybe not everybody, but still that's kind of presumption. And then they just do empirical projects, and it's kind of very difficult to come back to those normative commitments. However, that's not always the case. So for example, Lane Kenworthy wrote a very nice book, Defending Social Democracy, where he actually did that. He said, if normatively what we care about is this kind of utilitarian thing of making sure that most people's lives are good, I'm going to make the argument for social democracy, right? And so there, the normative and the empirical side are actually very close together. And you should check that book out. It's a nice book to read. He's very clear in defending the welfare state. So the answer is, there's not a moment in the history of sociology where we're going to say, this is going to be the connective tissue between all these normative claims and all these empirical claims. Rather, they kind of episodically inform each other.
We have time for one last question.
Yeah.
Related to your response just now. For disciplines outside sociology, what methods or mental models would you suggest that folks, scholars, adopt to improve the quality of their research?
Oh yeah, I think there's a lot of great things to think about. So sometimes there are particular theories or processes that sociology has created, which have been very fruitful. So for example, how many people have used Facebook? That's a social network, right? And I tell people, like, we invented the study of social networks. All Mark Zuckerberg did was write a graphical user interface for it, right? So understanding that you're living in a web of networks and those relationships can be very important and very valuable is a key aspect of sociology. Another thing is understanding when and how culture matters, right? Like, some societies really do see the world differently than other societies, and that's just a basic finding of anthropology and sociology, which is you just go to different places, they have really different values. There are some cultural universals, like most people like their mothers, no matter where they live. Maybe Stalin didn't like his mother, but most other people like their mothers. There's some universals, but still there's a lot of cultural variation. It has an impact, right? That's like a really, really big impact. That's a super important thing to know. Another thing that's really good for people outside of sociology to absorb is a real appreciation of the wide range of empirical evidence. So for example, one thing that I think economists could seriously learn from sociologists, which they actually used to know, but they forgot about it, is that a lot of evidence is incredibly informative, not just quantitative survey data or experiments. You know, so you'll go to an econ department, maybe not GMU, but some of these other most other departments, they'll say things like, you know, randomized controlled trials are the only form of knowledge. Like, really? You think Charles Darwin didn't learn anything by studying turtles, right? Like, he descriptively studied turtles and he learned a lot, right? And so even some of the great economists, so for example, Ronald Coase, he came up with theory of the firm after visiting an actual firm. On Econ Talk, I forget the name of the economist, but Russ Roberts runs Econ Talk, which is a cool podcast series. And one of his most recent guests a few weeks ago was an economist who actually visited prisons and refugee camps to understand how economies in risky environments are created, how they develop. And the guy was just like, I learned so much about economics by seeing actual economies work. And I'm not saying that, like, you know, these disciplines are bad disciplines or they're lame or anything. No, that's clearly not the case. What I'm saying is that every discipline has blind spots, right? And, you know, while sociology has blind spots, it's an incredible treasure, right? And so you should just read about culture, framing, theories of the self, theories of collective action, all that, these kinds of things, culture, you know, and really appreciate those and appreciate the wide range of evidence that you can marshal to test empirical claims. You know, I'll just end here because we're at the hour. C. Wright Mills, who actually was a left-wing guy, but I still think this is a wonderful book. He wrote a book called The Sociological Imagination. And, you know, he basically said, you know, what makes sociology different than the other social sciences is a certain imagination of people coming together. He was a progressive kind of guy, left guy. So he also said, you know, it's the ability to see inequality and that sort of thing, and to see power relationships. But still, you know, that's the sociological vision, which is, you know, it's every time there's an economic transaction, there's a human being there who has an identity, a culture, social relationships, and the person who takes the money also has culture and social relationships. Those two things are not separable. It's like everything coming together. And that's what I think is really amazing about sociology as a discipline.